Hey, what's up? My name is J.M. Chaley and welcome to my channel. This week I want to talk about medieval innovations. If you're a fantasy author like me who writes in the medieval fantasy genre, you've got a lot of medieval stuff going on because that's your genre. But so often we see in the medieval fantasy genre this kind of compilation of maybe the year 1100 or the year 1200 something mushed together with kind of the cool medieval stuff that we love, but with no real attention to the science and the gadgets and the innovations that were around during the time of the medieval period. How often have we seen something that looks like Braveheart, but they've got cool plate mail armor? That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. The medieval period lasted from the year 470 to the year 1500. It's sometimes called the Middle Ages, but it's pretty much the same thing. There was an early Middle Ages, a high Middle Ages, and a late Middle Ages, and it spanned almost 1,000 years. A lot of stuff was invented and discovered during that time. So let's talk about some of these amazing innovations, and who knows, maybe they're cool enough to wind up in your own work in progress. Now, before we get into the Middle Ages, we have to give a nod to the Age of Antiquity. These folks came up with so much in the way of science, astronomy, and math. This stuff was discovered during their heyday. But what happened was, as lands were conquered, as empires fell, a lot of these innovations were lost. The burning of Alexandria didn't help either. But what about your medieval fantasy world? Maybe these innovations happened during your Age of Antiquity and were not lost. So dipping our toe back into the Age of Antiquity, you gotta give a nod to the Romans. They had roads, they had aqueducts, they also had hot and cold running water. They had fast food. You could walk down the streets of Pompeii and say, hey, give me that, meat on a stick, and they'd boil it right there in front of you with the spices, add whatever you want, boop, bam, off you go. The Greeks actually invented the first steam turbine. This was in ancient times. I believe it was pronounced Iliolipoli. I'm probably butchering that, but it's also known as Hero's engine. The Greek that invented it was named Hero. And this basically consisted of a round ball with pipes coming out of it, and the water would boil underneath, the air in the ball would release, and it would spin. Now, conceptually, this was an idea of something that could be put into motion, a machine, but it never really amounted to anything. No one drove a machine with it, it didn't spin anything. It was a conceptual idea that didn't really go anywhere and kind of got lost until the Industrial Revolution, when someone said, hey, what if we use steam? But this stuff had been around for well over 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years before the first steam engines were actually built. In ancient times, there was central heating, there was ice cream, there was soda. So we do have to give a nod to the Age of Antiquity, but this video is about medieval innovation. So without further ado, let's get into the early medieval period, which spans from the year 470 to the year 999. In the year 470, we still have the Roman Empire, so there's still a lot of these innovations that were around and, eventually were going to become lost when the Roman Empire fell, but they hadn't been lost yet. Paper money started being used in China around the 7th century. This was a huge development, so simple but so easy. Just walking around without being laden with heavy metal coins in your pocket was a big deal. They had paper money, and this changed commerce and how things could be traded and bought and sold. Now, this was in China, and it stayed pretty much in Asia for a long time before the idea of paper money really caught on in other parts of the world. But this was an innovation that started very, very early on. The military advancements were a pretty big deal too. Scale armor was a big deal. The Anglos and the Visigoths and Romans started putting a lot more emphasis on cavalry during the early Middle Ages. This changed warfare tremendously. And finally, going back to China again, during the 9th century, gunpowder. Now, it wouldn't catch on to the rest of the world until later, but 9th century, this gave China a lot in the way of innovation. not just from a military standpoint, but fireworks. During the High Middle Ages, which were from the year 1000 to the year 1347, we saw advancements in astronomy and philosophy and mathematics. We dropped the Roman numeral system and went with an Arabic writing system for numbers. We saw the invention of algebra and the advancement of medicine. During the High Middle Ages, we saw the invention of windmills, which harnessed the power of the wind to grind grain and create very, very successful and industrious mills. We also saw the first mechanical clocks during the High Medieval period. Again, this was from the year 1000 to the year 1347. Mechanical clocks. One of the coolest mechanical devices that I think came out of the High Middle Ages was the astrolabe. And this was basically a pocket watch. Here's how it worked. You would aim your astrolabe at the night sky. You would point a certain dial towards a particular star in the night sky. All the stars were labeled in a tiny little star map on this particular dial. Then a second dial, you would change the date, June 5th. Once these two dials were set, a pointer pointed at the time. So you could actually see, based on the date and the height of the star in the sky, exactly what time it was. Now, during the day, I think they were able to look at the sun and figure out roughly the time. But being able to tell time at night with a little astrolabe, what time is it? Oh, it's, huge innovation. Towards the end of the High Middle Ages, we also saw gunpowder being used for firearms. This was probably between the years 1320 to the 1340s. We actually saw the first guns being created and used. During the late Middle Ages was the year 1348 to the year 1500. Here's where we start to have plate mail armor. I know we love shoving plate mail into kind of an early Middle Ages setting, but honestly, it didn't come until later. Why? Because of the advancements of weaponry, particularly the guns. There are a lot of museums, if you go in and look at the plate mail armor that's on display, they'll have a divot in it, which is caused by a blast from a ball from a gun, where they would test it out. Oh, you built me a nice cuirass, a nice breastplate or whatever? Great. Will it withstand a shot from a gun? Yeah, sure. Prove it. Bang. Okay, I'll buy it. So it was a big deal. Plate mail evolved out of necessity because of the innovations that had come before it. The first blast furnace came out in the year 1350 in Sweden. The first eyeglasses came out during the 1300s. The first public library came out in the year 1452 in Italy. So much in the way of philosophy and education had come a long way during the late Middle Ages period. And what am I forgetting? Oh yeah, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was around during the late Middle Ages. How can you forget about him? Now imagine a medieval fantasy genre where a Leonardo da Vinci kind of person exists, or maybe 12 of these kind of guys exist, because the science in your setting, maybe, had advanced and become prolific and accepted and popularized, right? Maybe there was no one that was going to torture someone like a Galileo for believing a certain way about the heavens, and they were allowed to advance their art. Maybe on your world, science was allowed to flourish. Who's to say what it would look like? You'd still have a medieval vibe to everything, and a pick of the litter from what kind of sciences you wanted to incorporate in your world. Leonardo da Vinci had ideas for flying machines. They didn't work, but maybe on your world, we're talking fantasy here, right? Maybe on your world, you could have flying machines. Leonardo da Vinci came up with the first patent for a machine gun. He invented a tank. I mean, irrigation machines, locks for rivers that can raise and lower things so people can get across. And an early idea for an automobile. I mean, we're talking the medieval period here. Still, in the late Middle Ages, we still didn't have steam. They had cogs and weights and pulleys and gears and things like that. So they did have machines, but they had to be manually pedaled or cranked or pulled by a horse or who knows what, right? But if we're talking about medieval fantasy and you take that technology and blend it with something like magic, who knows what you could have on your hands? You come up with something pretty cool. So one last thing I want you to consider. On Earth, we consider Mesopotamia to kind of be the first civilization. It came into being around 7,000 years ago, and by 6,000 years ago, it was a thriving city. The Roman Empire came out around 2,700 years ago. Now it fell. A lot of these empires fell and technology was lost. But in your setting, what was your world like? What was your age of antiquity like? Did empires fall? Was technology lost? Did you have 7,000 years of progress in your civilization? Did you have 2,000 years of uninterrupted progress in your civilization? Think about our own Middle Ages and how it advanced over the course of 1,000 years, where you started off with something like the Roman Empire and ended up with something like Leonardo da Vinci inventing the goddamn tank. What's it like in your world? With fantasy and magic and dragons and whatever you got. My advice for any fantasy author, especially the medieval fantasy genre, do some research into history and find out some of this cool stuff that was out there. Maybe a little bit of truth, a little bit of history might inspire some really cool, innovative, magical, or fantastical things on your world. So that about wraps it up. A very, very brief history of innovations during the Middle Ages, the medieval period. Maybe some of these things can be used in your world. Maybe it's something that you already have. I'd love to hear about the innovations and cool inventions or gadgets or science that exist in your setting. Let me know in the comments. Tell me all about it. I want to know. If you like this video, please give it a like. And as always, subscribe. I post every Thursday. And you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can read the first chapter of my novel, A Flower in Hell, on jmchaley.com. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.